"Leave the 5 wounded SEALs until morning," Chief Surgeon Ethan Ward ordered, and rookie nurse Claire Morgan stepped between him and the transfer papers. "No, sir. If we move them out of monitored trauma care, one of them may not make it to morning." Around them, Harbor Point Military Hospital strained under the aftermath of a failed night extraction. The only trauma operating room was occupied. The on-call surgical team was already fighting to save another patient, and 5 SEALs lay in adjacent bays awaiting beds in the overnight observation unit. Their scans showed no single injury demanding immediate surgery. Their bleeding appeared controlled. On paper, waiting was the safest use of limited resources. Ward held out his hand for the transfer forms. "They're stable. Observation will repeat vitals every 4 hours." Claire did not surrender the clipboard. 4 hours was the problem. She had been assigned to the men less than 20 minutes earlier, but their field cards gave her something the electronic chart did not: direction. Each card carried vital signs recorded during transport. Compared with those numbers, every man's pulse had risen. 4 had narrowing pulse pressures. 3 had skin turning cool beneath their warming blankets. The quietest patient, Petty Officer Daniel Hayes, had stopped complaining about his hip, but his breathing had become shallow and his answers arrived a second too late. Claire pressed 2 fingers to his wrist while watching his face. His radial pulse felt faster and weaker than the monitor suggested. She checked the blood pressure cuff placement, repeated the reading manually, then moved to the next bed and did the same. She was not searching for one dramatic number. She was tracking 5 bodies losing ground by degrees. "Their pressures are still within range," Ward said. Claire laid the transport cards beside the current flow sheets, aligning the times. "Individually, yes. Not as a trend." She showed him the sequence without mentioning instinct, rank, or anything she could not prove. "Their heart rates are climbing despite pain control. Their pulse pressures are narrowing. Hayes is less responsive than he was 12 minutes ago. If observation checks them at 4-hour intervals, deterioration becomes the first alarm." Ward looked from the cards to Hayes. "The operating room is unavailable." "Then my immediate goal isn't surgery," Claire said. "It's keeping all 5 on continuous monitoring until trauma can reassess them." A corpsman arrived with a wheelchair for the first transfer. Claire locked its brakes and pushed it back against the wall. It was a small action, but it stopped the machinery of the order. Ward's voice lowered. "You are on your 3rd week of orientation." "Yes, sir." "And you are refusing a direct patient placement order." Claire's thumb rested over the blank signature line. She could feel her pulse there, quick and hard, but her hand remained level. "I'm refusing to certify that 4-hour observation is safe." Hayes stirred. "Chief," he whispered toward the SEAL in the next bay, but his eyes failed to find him. Claire immediately repeated his pressure. It had fallen 11 points since her manual reading, while his heart rate climbed again. Not a collapse. Not yet. But the change was objective, timed, and documented. Ward took the clipboard, studied both readings, then cancelled the wheelchair with a sharp motion. He did not approve surgery or admit she was right. He ordered 15-minute nursing vitals until a trauma reassessment could be arranged, buying the men time without resolving the shortage that had placed them in danger. "You wanted responsibility," he said. "They remain here under your continuous watch. No missed assessments. No undocumented changes." He turned the transfer form over and placed it on the counter. "Now document your refusal." Claire opened the chart and entered the order she had challenged, the trends she had observed, and her formal objection. When she signed her name, the decision stopped being an argument that could disappear by morning. It became part of the permanent medical record. Ward added a variance report beside her workstation, the first step toward disciplinary review, then returned to the operating room. Claire pulled a stool into the narrow space between the 5 beds, close enough to reach every monitor but unwilling to rely on any of them alone. The men were still waiting. The difference was that now she had placed her license, her career, and her name between them and morning. How much could 15 minutes cost? Claire's timer reached 12 when Daniel Hayes lifted one hand from the blanket and tried to push himself upright. She caught his shoulder before his weight shifted. His skin felt colder than it had during her last assessment, yet a thin line of sweat shone above his lip. "Stay flat, Daniel." His gaze moved past her toward Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed in the next bay, but recognition arrived slowly. The monitor showed a heart rate of 118. His blood pressure remained barely acceptable, the kind of number that could reassure anyone who saw only the screen. Claire checked his pulse by hand, then counted his respirations without telling him. Faster. Shallower. She examined the field card again. The extraction note described a lateral crush during a vehicle rollover, followed by severe hip pain and a pelvic binder applied inside a dark aircraft. That binder now sat high across Hayes's waist. One edge had migrated above the bony points of his hips, where it could no longer compress the pelvic ring effectively. Claire did not press or rock his pelvis. Repeating that examination could disturb whatever clotting his body had managed. Instead, she lifted the blanket enough to compare his feet. His left leg rested slightly turned outward. The skin beyond the binder was pale, and the pulse at his ankle was present but faint. She reached for the call button, then stopped. Ward was scrubbed into the occupied trauma room. Calling him with another set of borderline numbers would consume time Hayes no longer had. Claire asked the corpsman to bring a replacement binder and 2 draw sheets. She increased Hayes's oxygen, confirmed both 4 lines were flowing, and requested an emergency blood sample under the standing trauma protocol. Then she looked across the narrow aisle at Reed and held her palm low, fingers closing once toward the floor. "Keep him down, keep him still." Reed's eyes fixed on her hand. Pain tightened his face, but he immediately braced his forearm against the rail separating their beds and spoke to Hayes in a calm command voice. "Stay with the ceiling, Danny. Don't move for anybody." Claire registered the response without pausing over it. With the corpsman supporting Hayes's shoulders and another nurse controlling his legs, she slid the draw sheets into position. They lifted only enough to move the binder down over the greater trochanters, then secured it according to the trauma protocol. Claire marked the time on the flowsheet. Hayes's breathing eased first. 3 minutes later, his pressure rose 6 points while his pulse stopped climbing. It was not a cure, and it did not make him stable. It was observable evidence that external compression had changed his circulation, and that the waiting order had concealed an injury still stealing from him. Claire called directly into the operating room. "This is Morgan in trauma holding. Hayes has a suspected unstable pelvic injury with worsening perfusion. His field binder had migrated above effective position. Repositioning produced a measurable hemodynamic response. He needs immediate trauma reassessment and blood availability." She gave the numbers, the times, and the mechanism. No speculation. No appeal to fear. Ward arrived 4 minutes later still wearing his surgical cap, with the strain of the other operation visible in the hard set of his shoulders. He reviewed the binder placement, the field card, Claire's documented assessments, and the fresh lab tube waiting for transport. Then he placed his own hand against Hayes's wrist. This time, he did not tell Claire to step aside. "Keep him supine," Ward said. He handed her the portable Doppler and moved to examine Hayes's abdomen without disturbing the pelvis. "Repeat distal pulses with me." Claire applied the probe. A weak rushing sound filled the bay. Ward listened, checked the latest pressure, then cancelled all 5 observation transfers. The decision kept them under continuous trauma care, but it also concentrated 5 wounded men in a space with limited staff, no open operating room, and dwindling nighttime resources. He ordered urgent imaging for Hayes and instructed Claire to remain responsible for the other 4 men's reassessments while he evaluated the suspected hemorrhage. Reed watched Ward begin working, then looked back at Claire's lowered hand. He said nothing about the signal she had used. Instead, he reached across the gap and gripped Hayes's bed rail, taking over the task she had silently given him. Ward signed beneath Claire's clinical note, acknowledging the change she had produced, but when he reached the variance report, he drew a line through nothing. "The transfer order is cancelled," he said. "Your refusal is not." Claire's fingers hovered over the chart for half a breath before she documented the intervention and accepted the assignment. She had prevented 1 man from disappearing quietly into morning. In doing so, she had become personally accountable for watching all 5, and the first patient had already shown her that 15 minutes could be more than the next one had left. The blood bank had only 4 uncross-matched units immediately available, and Claire was now responsible for 5 men who might need them before the operating room opened. Hayes required urgent imaging, but moving him would leave the other 4 under a single corpsman's watch. One had a chest injury requiring repeated respiratory checks. Another was receiving fluids for a pressure that had begun drifting downward. Reed remained alert, but his abdomen was growing rigid beneath the edge of his blanket. The 5th seal had not worsened yet, which no longer felt like reassurance. Claire looked at the wall clock, the closed operating room doors, and the transfer order Ward had cancelled. Keeping the men in trauma care had prevented a dangerous delay. It had not created the staff, blood, or surgical capacity needed to treat them. She opened the red emergency procedure binder beneath the charge desk and found the trauma surge provision. The policy was rarely used at night, but its language was clear: 3 or more simultaneous trauma patients with probable need for operative or blood bank support qualified for an internal surge alert. Any licensed clinician directly responsible for the patients could initiate it when delay posed a credible threat, though the activating clinician's name would be attached to the review. Claire read the threshold once, closed the binder, and called the hospital operator. Activate an internal trauma surge for 5 patients in holding. Notify the nursing supervisor, reserve anesthesia, blood bank, respiratory therapy, and the backup operating room team. Activating clinician is Claire Morgan, registered nurse. The operator hesitated. I don't have an attending authorization attached. Claire watched Reed press his forearm against his abdomen as another wave of pain passed. The policy does not require one. Use my name. The overhead page sounded less than 30 seconds later. Claire did not wait for people to arrive and discover chaos. She moved the 5 charts to separate stations, wrote each patient's immediate risk and next required action on the trauma board, then assigned the corpsman to remain with Reed while she placed portable oxygen, suction, and emergency supplies between the bays. She reserved 2 blood units for Hayes but refused to claim the remaining supply blindly. Instead, she sent current samples from all 5 men and asked the blood bank to begin type-specific preparation, preserving the uncross-matched units for the patient who deteriorated first. When the reserve anesthesia nurse entered, Claire gave her Hayes's trend, intervention, and response in less than 20 seconds. Respiratory therapy received the chest injury patient without needing to repeat a full assessment. The blood bank technician collected the labeled specimens and confirmed that additional units could be released once compatibility testing began. Separate tasks that would have occurred one after another were now moving in parallel. The change became visible across the room. Monitors were no longer sounding into empty space. Each man had a named clinician, a defined risk, and a timed reassessment. Hayes still needed surgery, but he was no longer consuming every available pair of hands while the other 4 waited unobserved. Ward came out of the operating room as the backup team wheeled equipment toward the second surgical suite. His gaze traveled from the trauma board to the arriving staff, then settled on Claire. Who activated surge protocol? I did. Without consulting me. You were operating, and 5 patients were competing for one sequential response. The cancelled transfers made that unsafe. Ward picked up the emergency binder and checked the provision she had cited. Claire kept both hands on the counter so he would not see her pressing one thumb into the other palm. The page had committed personnel, opened protected supplies, and created a hospital-level record under her name. If her judgment was considered unjustified, this would no longer be handled as a disagreement over one transfer form. Ward looked toward the bays. The anesthesia nurse had already stabilized Hayes for transport. Respiratory therapy reported unchanged breath sounds in the chest injury patient. The blood bank called to confirm compatibility testing was underway for all 5. Observable work had replaced delay. Ward handed Claire the trauma coordinator phone, a device normally carried by the charge nurse or attending team leader. You initiated the response. You coordinate patient flow until I can release the operating room. It was not praise. It was authority tied directly to accountability. He then told the backup team to continue preparing the second suite, placing his own decision behind the machinery Claire had started. At the door, he stopped. If this activation cannot be justified, the review starts with you. Claire clipped the phone to her scrub pocket. Its weight seemed greater than the device itself. She had broken the boundary that allowed a rookie to say she was only following instructions. Now every call, every unit of blood, and every minute assigned among the 5 wounded men would carry her judgment, and before the night was over, she might have to decide which one could no longer afford to wait. The coordinator phone vibrated against Claire's hip just as Lieutenant Owen Brooks tore off his oxygen mask and reached for his chest. His monitor showed a sudden rise in heart rate, but the more important change was physical. The right side of his chest barely moved while the left continued to rise. His lips had begun losing color, and the clear breath sounds documented 6 minutes earlier were now sharply diminished on one side. At the same moment, transport called for Hayes, the blood bank requested allocation instructions, and Ward's voice came through the phone asking whether the 5 men could hold for 10 more minutes. Claire looked from Hayes's pale face to Brooks fighting for each breath. She could preserve the orderly plan she had built, or break it to protect the man whose condition was changing fastest. Hayes remains here, she told transport. Blood bank, keep his 2 units reserved but do not send them yet. Dr. Ward, Brooks has acute respiratory decline after blunt chest trauma. Right-sided movement is reduced, breath sounds are nearly absent, and his pressure is falling. Ward's answer came beneath the muted sounds of the operating room. Get a portable chest film. Claire watched Brooks's neck tighten with another shallow breath. Waiting for imaging would protect procedure. It would not protect him. He may not tolerate the delay, she said. I need you at this bedside now. The line went quiet for 1 beat. Claire was not diagnosing beyond her authority, and she would not perform an invasive procedure she was not credentialed to perform. But restraint did not mean surrendering judgment. She handed the coordinator phone to the reserve anesthesia nurse. Maintain the board and relay every change to me. No patient moves without direct reassessment. Then she pulled the emergency chest tray to Brooks's bay, opened the oxygen flow fully, lowered the head of the bed slightly as his pressure continued to drop, and exposed only enough of his upper chest for examination. She checked the tubing, traced the oxygen connection, repeated the pressure manually, and marked the rapid decline aloud so every clinician present heard the same facts. Owen, look at me. Brooks's eyes found hers, unfocused but responsive. Short breaths. Don't fight the mask. His hand locked around her wrist. Claire did not pull away. She matched her breathing to the pace she wanted from him while the monitor alarm accelerated beside them. Ward entered with his surgical gown removed and one glove still clenched in his hand. Claire gave him the progression in seconds, then placed the stethoscope into his palm rather than telling him what procedure to perform. He examined Brooks, heard the asymmetry, and made the decision himself. Suspected tension physiology. Prepare for decompression. Claire had already arranged the supplies in working order, but she remained on her side of the professional boundary. She confirmed the correct patient and side with Ward, cleansed the site he identified, connected the monitoring leads away from the sterile field, and passed only the instruments he requested. Ward performed the emergency decompression. A brief rush of trapped air escaped, and Brooks's next breath came deeper. His heart rate began to slow. The manual pressure Claire obtained 2 minutes later had risen enough to restore a palpable wrist pulse. Ward ordered a chest tube and definitive imaging, but his behavior had already changed before the orders were entered. He did not reclaim the coordinator phone or remove Claire from the decisions. Instead, he told the anesthesia nurse, follow Morgan's patient flow priorities. I'm sharing responsibility for every allocation she makes. Then he remained beside Claire to secure Brooks's stabilization rather than returning immediately to the operating room. That choice cost them both. Hayes's trip to imaging had been delayed. The second suite was ready but still lacked a completed priority list. 4 units of emergency blood remained for 5 men, and Ward's absence from the first operating room could last only as long as his colleague could safely carry the case. Claire glanced at Brooks's hand, still closed around her wrist. When his grip loosened, a faint tremor passed through her fingers before she flattened them against the mattress. She had protected him without crossing the limit that could have removed her from all 5 beds. But by forcing Ward to leave surgery and act on her assessment, she had placed his judgment beside hers in the permanent record. Ward saw the delayed imaging notice appear on the coordinator phone. "We can send Hayes now," he said, "or preserve the second suite for whichever man crashes next. We cannot guarantee both." Claire looked across the 5 bays. Brooks was breathing, but required a procedure room. Hayes was temporarily holding, but likely bleeding internally. Reed's abdominal pain was worsening, and 2 others remained dependent on the continuous watch she had fought to preserve. Morning was still hours away. Claire took back the coordinator phone, and Ward did not release it until their hands briefly shared its weight. She was no longer a rookie objecting alone to his order. He had acted on her judgment, accepted part of its risk, and left the next allocation in her hands. Now Claire had to choose which wounded SEAL would receive the hospital's first truly limited chance, and which 4 would pay for the time she gave him. Claire made the choice before another minute could become an excuse. "Hayes gets the second suite," she said. "Brooks stays here for the chest tube. Reed remains under continuous abdominal reassessment. We preserve the remaining uncross-matched blood until the next objective decline." Ward studied the trauma board rather than her face. Hayes's blood pressure had improved after the pelvic binder was corrected, but the improvement was temporary. His pulse was climbing again. His skin remained cold, and the delayed responses that Claire had tracked were becoming shorter, flatter, harder to draw out. Brooks looked more desperate, yet the emergency decompression had restored enough circulation for Ward to complete his chest treatment at the bedside with the prepared team. Hayes was quieter. That made him easier to postpone and more likely to die without attracting attention. "Imaging would define the injury," Ward said. "But moving him there costs time," Claire answered. "The binder response already gave us functional evidence. He improved when the pelvic ring was compressed, then began losing ground again. He needs hemorrhage control, not a cleaner chart." Ward moved between the beds and examined each man again. Claire followed with the coordinator phone in one hand and the 5 trend sheets in the other. She did not argue that Hayes was the most injured. She showed that his remaining window was closing fastest. Brooks's oxygen level had improved after decompression. Reed's pressure was holding despite his worsening pain. The other 2 SEALs remained responsive with stable manual readings. Hayes alone was deteriorating despite the intervention that had briefly helped him. Ward reached the same conclusion aloud. "Hayes goes first." Then he faced the backup surgical team. "That is our priority decision. I support it." Those words changed more than the destination of one bed. Until then, Claire's judgment had existed beneath Ward's authority, vulnerable to being reversed whenever pressure rose. Now he had placed his name beside hers before the outcome was known. Claire assigned the reserve anesthesia nurse to Hayes, confirmed that 2 units of blood would travel with him, and ordered fresh assessments on the 4 men staying behind. As the bed began moving, Hayes's hand slipped from beneath the blanket and searched weakly along the rail. Reed saw it from the next bay. "Danny," he called. "We're here." Hayes turned toward the voice but could not focus. Claire walked beside him as far as the surgical doors. "You're going in now," she said. "The others are being watched." His fingers closed once around hers, then released when the team took him through. The doors shut, leaving Claire with 4 patients and less blood than before. Reed's gaze followed her back to the center aisle. "You ranked us by who would disappear first," he said quietly. It was not the language used on the hospital board, but Claire understood it. "I ranked the changes I could verify." Reed watched her check the time beneath Hayes's last recorded pressure. "That isn't how someone learns triage during hospital orientation." Claire capped her pen. "Tonight, it's how 5 men reach morning." She gave him no other answer, and Reed did not ask again. Instead, when his own pain increased, he reported the exact location and timing without minimizing it for his team. His cooperation was the first visible consequence of the decision. He no longer treated Claire as someone standing outside their survival. 28 minutes later, Ward called from surgery. The suspected pelvic injury had been confirmed, and damage control measures had slowed the hemorrhage. Hayes had reached the suite with little time to spare. The practical victory lasted only as long as Claire needed to record it. Then the monitor over the fifth bed changed rhythm. Petty Officer Eli Carter had remained the steadiest of the group, speaking clearly and insisting that the others be treated first. Now his urine output had fallen sharply, his pressure was drifting down, and his answers had become clipped by exhaustion. Claire checked his 4 sites, repeated his pressure manually, assessed his skin and mental status, then looked at the remaining blood allocation. Hayes' successful operation had consumed the units reserved for him. Brooks still needed definitive chest care. Reed's abdominal findings were worsening. The choice Claire had made was correct, but correctness had not protected Carter from the time it cost him. Ward returned as Hayes was transferred toward recovery. He reviewed Carter's new trend and then handed Claire the marker for the trauma board. He did not take over the prioritization. "Update the order," he said. "I'll work from your sequence." Claire stood before the 5 names. For the first time that night, her hand hesitated. Choosing Hayes had saved him, exposed the depth of her judgment, and earned Ward's operational trust. It had also removed the last shelter of being merely the rookie who had refused an order. Every man still waiting would now be measured against the consequences of her decisions. She moved Carter's name upward, directly beneath Reed's, and wrote the reassessment deadline beside it. Then she drew a line through her own scheduled relief time. She had won the authority to shape the night. To keep it, she would have to remain long enough to carry what her choices did to all 5 men. Claire capped the marker as Carter's pressure fell again and Reed curled one hand over his rigid abdomen. 2 men now needed the second operating room, and only one could enter it. Ward reviewed both trend sheets while Claire checked Carter's capillary refill and urine output. Reed's findings pointed toward active abdominal bleeding. Carter's decline was slower but broader, suggesting that hours of injury, cold, and inadequate circulation were beginning to overwhelm him. If Ward took Carter first, Reed could lose his remaining window. If he took Reed, Claire would have to keep Carter alive without the blood or surgical support already committed elsewhere. "Reed goes to the suite," Claire said. "Carter stays with me for active stabilization." Ward's eyes remained on Carter. "That could leave you holding a patient who needs more than nursing support. Then define the limits before you go." Claire's voice stayed level, but her hand tightened around the marker. "Give me parameters for blood release, warming, repeat labs, and when you want the operating room interrupted. Don't leave me with, wait and watch." The words landed harder than she intended. For an instant, the overhead lights became the color of a transport cabin before dawn. She remembered another monitor, another order to hold until visibility improved, and a young man asking whether daylight was close. Claire pressed the marker onto its tray until the memory narrowed back into Carter's breathing. This was not that night. She had information, resources, and a surgeon willing to listen. What she could not accept was delay without ownership. Ward heard the strain beneath her restraint. "Why does morning sound like a death sentence when you say it?" Claire looked at Carter before answering. His eyes were open, and his life mattered more than the privacy she had protected. "Before nursing school, I served as a special warfare trauma corpsman. On my last deployment, I followed an order to hold a casualty until daylight evacuation." Her throat moved once. He was conscious when the order came. He wasn't when the aircraft arrived. She offered no unit name, rank, or story beyond what Ward needed to understand the decision in front of him. "I know what prolonged low perfusion looks like before the monitor makes it dramatic. I also know that memory is not a clinical indication. That's why every recommendation tonight is documented." Ward studied the sequence she had built across Carter's chart, falling urine output, narrowing pressure, increasing heart rate, cooling skin, delayed responses, and the resources already used. Her past did not make those facts true. It explained why she refused to look away from them. He turned to the reserve anesthesia nurse. "Prepare Reed for immediate surgery." Then he wrote explicit stabilization orders for Carter, including warmed fluids, repeat laboratory testing, continuous monitoring, and conditional release of type-specific blood if the defined thresholds were reached. He placed the trauma coordinator phone back in Claire's hand. "You direct the bedside team. If Carter crosses any one of these limits, call the operating room and I stop, no matter where I am in Reed's case. Stopping could endanger Reed. Yes. Ward signed beneath the parameters, then added his name beside Claire's surge activation. That decision will belong to both of us. The cost of his trust was no longer professional courtesy. He was allowing her assessment to interrupt his surgery, while Claire was accepting responsibility for deciding when one wounded man's need outweighed another's safety. Reed heard enough to understand. As his bed began moving, he caught Ward's sleeve. If she calls, you answer. Ward covered Reed's hand briefly. I will. Reed released him and looked toward Claire. He did not ask about the past she had exposed. Keep Eli here when I come back. Claire met his gaze. I'll use every minute we have. Once the surgical doors closed behind Reed, she reorganized the remaining team around Carter. She stopped the routine fluid bolus when his lungs developed faint basal crackles, shifted to controlled warming, requested the prepared type-specific blood, and set reassessment intervals shorter than Ward's outer limits. Carter opened his eyes as she tucked the warming blanket around his shoulders. You missed relief, he murmured. Claire glanced at the line she had drawn through her departure time. So did you. His mouth moved in the shadow of a smile, then his eyes closed again. The first prepared unit arrived, but Claire did not start it automatically. She verified his identity, checked the latest pressure, and waited only long enough to confirm that he had crossed the agreed threshold. Then she initiated the transfusion and called Ward with the exact change. Continue, he answered from the operating room. I'm working from your assessment. Carter's pressure steadied, but his urine output did not recover. The intervention had bought time without reversing the damage, and only one prepared unit remained outside the operating room. Claire placed her palm against the bed rail until the tremor in her fingers stopped. By revealing the loss she had kept buried, she had gained the authority to prevent another passive wait. She had also surrendered every remaining place to hide if Carter failed. When his next pressure began sliding before the transfusion was complete, Claire lifted the coordinator phone. Ward was still operating on Reed, the final blood unit sat beside her, and the limits they had written together were closing. This time, Claire would not merely refuse to wait. She would have to decide exactly when saving Carter required risking the man already on Ward's table. Claire made the call before Carter's falling pressure crossed the final limit. Dr. Ward, Carter is declining during transfusion. Urine output remains absent, his mentation is worsening, and the last prepared unit is already running. I need you to activate the interruption plan now. Silence held the line for 2 seconds. In the operating room, Ward had Reed's bleeding controlled but had not completed definitive repair. Continuing would give Reed the better outcome. Leaving would protect Carter's rapidly closing chance. I can shorten Reed's procedure to damage control and transfer him to intensive care, Ward said. That exposes him to another operation later. Claire looked at Carter, then through the glass toward Hayes in recovery and Brooks breathing through the chest tube Ward had placed. Every decision since the order to leave the 5 men until morning had narrowed into this one. If you continue definitive repair, Carter may never reach an operating room. Secure Reed for transfer. I'll have Carter ready when you come out. Ward did not ask her to soften the recommendation. Do it. Claire returned the phone to her pocket and converted the trauma bay from a place of observation into a bridge to surgery. She assigned the anesthesia nurse to Carter's airway and circulation, had the corpsman continue timed manual pressures, and directed respiratory therapy to bring the portable ventilator already staged during the surge response. Carter's remaining blood ran through the warmer. Claire limited crystalloid rather than diluting what clotting capacity he still had, covered every exposed surface, and kept him level as the team moved equipment around him. The first operating room had finished its original case, but it was still being turned over, and its regular team was not ready. Waiting for ideal conditions would repeat the very choice Claire had spent the night refusing. She called the room and gave them a minimum setup, warming, rapid infusion capability, damage control instruments, and only the supplies Ward would need to stop the immediate threat. Then Carter opened his eyes and caught the sleeve of her scrub top. Reed? His voice was barely audible. Claire bent close enough that he did not have to spend another breath. He made it through the dangerous part. Dr. Ward is coming for you. Don't trade him. I won't. The answer cost her because she could not promise equal outcomes. She could promise that neither man would be abandoned to protect the easier decision. Ward emerged minutes later and stripped off his outer gown while walking. Reed is stabilized for intensive care. He'll require another procedure if he holds. That consequence remained between them. Claire had asked Ward to stop, and Ward had accepted the risk. He took Carter's latest readings from her, then glanced toward the operating room, where only the essential stations were ready. We can wait for the full team. No, Claire said. We use the team we have and keep the resuscitation moving through transfer. Every pause puts him further behind. Ward looked once at Carter, then placed both hands on the bed rail beside Claire's. On your count. She directed the move. The anesthesia nurse controlled the airway. The corpsman managed the lines. Ward kept pressure over the suspected source of internal bleeding while Claire walked backward at Carter's shoulder, calling each pressure, pulse change, and transfusion time into the room ahead. Nothing about the transfer was dramatic from a distance. No one ran. No one shouted. Its precision was the result of 6 hours spent learning exactly what delay had been taking from all 5 men. Inside the operating room, Claire delivered Carter's trend and response to Ward without embellishment. Ward chose an abbreviated damage control approach designed to stop the immediate bleeding and limit physiologic stress rather than attempt a longer definitive repair. Claire remained at the edge of the sterile field, coordinating warming, blood timing, laboratory checks, and communication with the patients outside. When Carter's pressure began to rise, it did not leap into safety. It climbed a few points, held, then climbed again. His skin slowly regained warmth beneath Claire's hand. The proof arrived in increments, just as the danger had. Before dawn reached the high windows, Carter was transferred to intensive care alive. Reed remained stable after the shortened operation. Hayes was recovering from hemorrhage control. Brooks was breathing evenly with definitive chest treatment in place. The other 2 SEALs had completed repeated reassessments without hidden deterioration. 5 beds that had been ordered to wait until morning were now empty because every man had received active treatment before it came. Claire stood alone in the trauma bay for a moment, her hand resting on the stool she had placed between them hours earlier. Ward entered carrying the variance report and the unauthorized surge documentation. All 5 are alive, he said. He did not offer the sentence as absolution. Reed faces another operation. You crossed procedure. I interrupted surgery. This will be reviewed. Claire removed the coordinator phone from her pocket and held it out. Ward closed her fingers around it instead. Keep it until every handoff is complete. We finish the responsibility before we answer for it. Claire nodded and walked with him toward intensive care. She had refused to leave 5 wounded men to mourning. Now morning had arrived, bringing the cost of that refusal with it, and Ward no longer walked ahead of her issuing orders. He walked beside her, carrying his share. Ward stayed beside Claire through every intensive care handoff, correcting nothing and adding only what he had personally done. At Hayes's bed, Claire reported the pelvic binder response and the decision to bypass further imaging. At Brooks's bed, Ward documented that he had left surgery after Claire identified the respiratory decline. At Reed's bedside, they explained together why his operation had been shortened to make room for Carter. Each account placed another choice into the record, not as a victory, but as responsibility with names attached. Reed was pale beneath the recovery blankets, his voice rough from anesthesia. When Claire finished checking his reassessment schedule, he looked toward Ward. She called. You answered. Ward adjusted the chart against the rail. Yes. Reed gave a tired nod, then closed his eyes. Nothing more was needed. Outside Carter's room, Claire removed the coordinator phone from her pocket again. Ward accepted it this time, but instead of clipping it to his own coat, he handed it to the day-charged nurse and reviewed every pending assessment before releasing Claire from command. No patient was left beneath the word stable without a time, a threshold, and a clinician responsible for noticing change. Only when the final handoff was signed did Ward lead Claire toward the conference room where the overnight response would be reviewed. 2 chairs waited at opposite ends of the table. Ward moved one until they stood side by side. Claire placed her documentation in front of her, the refused transfer order, 15-minute assessments, surge activation, blood allocations, and the sequence that had sent Hayes, Reed, and Carter to surgery. Her hands were steady until she reached the original variance report. The paper still carried her name alone. Ward took it from beneath her fingers and set his operative interruption record beside it. When the questions began, Claire answered without hiding behind her former military service. She acknowledged activating the surge without first consulting Ward. She acknowledged refusing the placement order and directing resources beyond what a nurse in orientation would ordinarily control. "I crossed procedural boundaries," she said. "I did it after documenting progressive changes in 5 trauma patients whose planned level of observation could not detect them in time. I accept review of those decisions." Ward could have allowed the sentence to stand by itself. Instead, he opened the first trend sheet. "My original order created the conditions that made those decisions necessary." He traced the rising pulse and narrowing pressure Claire had marked before anyone else changed course. "I treated acceptable numbers as evidence that delay was harmless." Nurse Morgan recognized that all 5 men were moving in the wrong direction. "I cancelled the transfers because her reassessment produced objective proof. Every decision after that was made with my knowledge, my participation, or my written authorization." Claire turned slightly toward him. Ward did not look back for approval. He continued through the record, naming where he had resisted, where he had acted, and where he had accepted her priorities. He did not protect her by pretending she had followed every rule. He protected the truth by refusing to let hierarchy place the entire cost on the person with the least power in the room. When the review paused, Claire found Ward in the corridor outside Carter's room. He was reading the newest laboratory results while a day-shift nurse checked Carter's monitor. The nurse noticed a small change in his pressure, compared it with the overnight trend, and immediately repeated it manually. She did not silence the alert or wait for the scheduled round. She called the resident, documented the direction of change, and remained at the bedside until the plan was updated. Claire watched without speaking. The standard had moved from one pair of hands into another. Ward returned the chart to its holder and stepped away from the door, leaving Claire the space nearest Carter. She entered, adjusted the warming blanket at his shoulder, and checked that the call button rested within reach. Carter opened his eyes. "Morning," he whispered. Claire looked at the pale light crossing the floor. Her hand stopped for a moment on the bed rail before she released it. "Yes." Carter turned his head toward the neighboring rooms where the others were recovering. "All of us?" "All 5. His eyes closed again, not from fading this time, but from permission to rest. Ward remained outside the glass rather than calling Claire away. When she finally came out, he held the door open and matched her pace toward the nurse's station. The review was not finished, Reed still faced another operation, and neither career was secure. But Claire no longer carried the night alone, and Ward no longer treated responsibility as something rank could assign downward. Behind them, the day nurse reset Carter's reassessment timer for 15 minutes and pulled a stool beside his bed. The day nurse's timer sounded, and she was already at Carter's bedside before the monitor could call for her. She compared his pressure with the overnight trend, repeated it manually, and wrote the next threshold beside her name. Ward watched from the nurse's station, then removed the old placement order from the active chart. In its place, he entered continuous reassessment instructions for every recovering SEAL and signed himself as the physician responsible for responding. Claire reached for the remaining charts, but Ward divided the stack and placed half beneath his arm. They completed the morning together. The review continued after Claire finally slept. It found that she had exceeded the normal authority of a nurse in orientation, but it also found that each escalation had followed documented deterioration and an existing emergency provision. Ward's original delay order, her formal objection, and his later decisions remained together in the record. Neither was allowed to carry only the part that made them look right. Claire returned to supervised duty. Ward returned to surgery. Between them, the stool remained beside whichever trauma patient required the closest watch, and the coordinator phone changed hands according to responsibility rather than rank. In the weeks that followed, Hayes began walking with assistance. Brooks no longer needed the chest tube. Reed completed the operation postponed when Ward left to save Carter, and Carter's kidneys slowly recovered. The other two men were discharged first, but they continued returning until their entire team could leave together. On that morning, Claire entered trauma holding and found 5 empty beds. Clean blankets lay folded at their feet. The men stood beyond them in civilian clothes, moving carefully but standing on their own. Reed stepped forward without ceremony and placed 5 discharge wristbands on the counter. "No one waited alone," he said. Claire touched the bands once, then pushed them toward the clerk for proper disposal. What mattered was not something she could keep. Ward arrived carrying a draft of the hospital's revised overnight trauma procedure. It did not bear Claire's name. It required that any decision to delay care for multiple trauma patients include continuous trending, defined reassessment intervals, escalation thresholds, and a named clinician accountable for responding. Ward set the document between them with 2 signature lines at the bottom. One was his. The other was not an approval line or a place for Claire to accept his plan. It identified her as the nursing co-author. Claire read the final provision, then looked through the glass at the day nurse pulling a stool between 2 newly occupied trauma bays. The nurse checked both transport cards against current readings before touching the transfer forms. When one trend did not align, she stopped the orderly, called the physician, and kept both patients where they could be watched. Claire had given no instruction. Ward had issued no correction. The nurse simply remained beside the people whose waiting now carried a name and a consequence. Ward offered Claire the pen. At the beginning of the night, signing her name had meant standing alone beneath an order she refused to obey. Now the second line meant accepting a place beside the man who had learned to share both judgment and cost. Claire signed. Ward took the coordinator phone from his pocket, but instead of placing it in her hand, he set it on the counter between them. Claire rested her palm beside it. She did not pick it up alone. Ward covered the other side, and together they passed it to the nurse seated between the 2 beds. Behind them, the 5 SEALs walked toward the exit as one team. Ahead of them, the reassessment timer began counting down, not toward morning, but toward the next pair of hands already willing to stay.